If you could step into the world 200,000 years ago, you wouldn't last an hour. Everything around you was a threat. Every sound meant danger. Every day was a gamble. Prehistoric humans didn't worry about grocery lists or deadlines. They worried about staying alive long enough to see one more sunrise. The world they lived in wasn't built for them. It was built for predators, storms, droughts, and landscapes that changed without warning. Humans were slow, fragile, easily injured, and always one mistake away from disappearing. But even though life was brutal, humans managed to survive by doing the only thing that kept them alive: adapting. They learned to notice things other animals didn't: tracks in the dirt, subtle changes in weather, animal patterns, the smell of water. They figured out which plants kept you alive and which ones killed you. They discovered fire, not by accident but through patience, fear, and desperation. Because controlling fire wasn't just useful, it changed the entire balance of survival. But the biggest threat prehistoric humans faced wasn't a specific predator or a giant beast. It wasn't a disease or a rival group. The biggest threat was the world itself, constantly shifting in ways no human could predict. One decade, a region would be lush and green, full of prey and water, and the next decade, it would be dry, empty, and deadly. Prehistoric humans lived through repeated climate swings that forced them to move, change strategies, and relearn everything from scratch. You could grow up in a safe, fertile place and die in a wasteland without ever leaving home. And the world pushed humans so hard, so often, that only the most adaptable survived. The ones who learned quickly lived. The ones who didn't simply vanished. But something else was happening underneath all this danger. As humans learned to navigate a world that constantly threatened them, they became better hunters, better thinkers, and better communicators. They formed stronger groups with more cooperation and more strategy. And that created a new kind of threat, one that didn't come from nature at all, but from humans themselves. As humans got better at surviving the natural world, a strange shift began. The dangers outside, the predators, the storms, the starvation were still there, but humans were slowly getting ahead of them. They cooperated in new ways, shared food, used fire to stay safe at night, and carried simple tools that made them far more capable than the fragile creatures they started as. And once they became better at avoiding nature's dangers, something unexpected happened. The greatest threat they faced wasn't outside anymore. It came from each other. This didn't start with wars or huge fights. Nobody had armies. Nobody was building walls or planning giant attacks. It began in small, simple moments: two groups meeting at the same water source, both hungry, both tired, both claiming the same place, because without it, they might not survive. In a world where food was unpredictable and water could be the difference between life and death, sharing wasn't an obvious option. A watering hole wasn't just a resource. It was survival, and if you lost it, you might lose everything. So when early human groups crossed paths, they didn't see potential allies. They saw competition. They saw strangers who might take the berries, or scare away the prey, or drink the last bit of water before the heat returned. And that tension grew every year as humans spread out. When the climate shifted, groups moved. When animals migrated, groups followed. Sometimes two communities ended up in the same valley, in the same season, chasing the same shrinking resources. And in those moments, humans were more dangerous than any predator. A lion only kills if it's hungry. A prehistoric human might kill because he feared what would happen tomorrow, or because he wanted to protect his family, or because his group pressured him to show strength. Fear didn't bring people together, it pushed them apart. Competition wasn't just about territory. It was also about safety within the group. Humans depended on each other more than any other species on Earth. If someone threatened the group's unity, even accidentally, the consequences could be deadly. Conflict inside the group wasn't rare. A disagreement over food, a dispute over a hunting mistake, a challenge for leadership. These weren't simple arguments. If you damaged trust, you could be pushed out. And being alone in a prehistoric world was basically a slow death. That pressure shaped behavior. You had to read people, understand tension, avoid unnecessary fights, and know when to stand your ground. Every human carried both the need to cooperate and the instinct to compete. Those two instincts constantly crashed into each other. And over time, humans became more strategic. They remembered who helped them. They remembered who threatened them. They started thinking ahead, not just about finding food, but about protecting alliances and avoiding enemies. This created a new type of intelligence, not sharp teeth or fast legs. Social intelligence, knowing who to trust, who to avoid, who to follow. People who understood social dynamics survived. People who miscalculated didn't. And while this internal danger grew, outside pressures were still there. Droughts pushed groups closer together. Scarcity made everyone uneasy. The closer humans lived to each other, competing over the same shrinking patches of land, the more intense the tension became. Sometimes small conflicts stayed small. Other times, fear turned into aggression. One group would strike first, even if they didn't need to, simply because waiting felt more dangerous. Humans were the first species whose main predator became themselves. But it wasn't all destruction. Competition forced humans to improve. Better hunting strategies, better tools, better communication. If you didn't adapt fast enough, someone else did, and that shaped evolution. But the danger wasn't only about fighting or territory. Humans also threatened each other in ways they didn't understand yet. Sickness. As groups grew slightly larger, even before farming, they sometimes stayed in the same place longer than earlier generations had. That meant trash, animal remains, and waste built up, and diseases spread faster. Something as small as one infected animal or one contaminated water source could wipe out most of a group before anyone figured out what was happening. No predator could kill as many humans as sickness could, and humans accidentally created situations that let sickness grow. But the real danger, the thing that fused all these problems together, was unpredictability. You never knew whether a group you encountered would offer help or throw a spear. You never knew whether sharing food would build trust or show weakness. You never knew whether leaving your territory meant opportunity or death. Humans were learning how to navigate a social world just as dangerous as the natural one. And the unsettling truth is this. Once humans became more intelligent, more organized, and more dependent on each other, they also became capable of causing disasters no other species could. Predators could kill individuals. Nature could wipe out groups. But humans could destroy their own future if they chose poorly. That pressure choosing right, avoiding conflict, managing fear shaped the human mind. It forced people to plan, communicate, negotiate, and pay attention. And that skill would later save humanity when the world changed again. Humans had survived nature. Now they had to survive each other. But the biggest shift, the one that created entirely new dangers, was still coming. The moment humans stopped roaming and planted the first seeds, everything they knew about survival changed overnight. When humans first started farming, it probably didn't feel like a dramatic turning point. It probably started with someone noticing that plants grew better where seeds had fallen the season before. Or someone realized that staying near a river made life easier than walking miles every day. Little ideas. Small experiments. Nothing that looked dangerous. But for prehistoric humans, planting those first seeds was the biggest gamble they had ever taken, and it introduced a new kind of threat, one they weren't prepared for at all. Before farming, humans lived with movement. If a place dried up, they left. If animals vanished, they followed. If disaster hit, they shifted their entire world to survive. Flexibility was their strength. It was the one thing that kept them alive through millions of years of unpredictable change. Farming removed that strength overnight. Suddenly, humans were tied to dirt, to seasons, to rainfall. Their survival depended on a tiny patch of land behaving exactly the way they hoped. If that land failed, their entire life strategy collapsed with it. A hunter-gatherer group could lose food sources and relocate within a day. A farming community could lose food sources and spend the next year starving. And for the first time, survival wasn't based on daily choices. It was based on yearly bets. If the seeds sprouted, the community lived. If they didn't, nothing could save them. Humans had traded adaptability for stability, and that stability made the world far more dangerous. The risk didn't stop at crops. Staying in one place created new problems that early humans had never faced. Season after season of tending the same fields meant people gathered in larger numbers than ever before. Living close together meant sharing everything: good news, food, tools, and also germs. Diseases that would have burned out quickly in tiny moving groups now lasted longer and spread faster. Cuts got infected more easily. Parasites stayed around. Contaminated water made entire families sick. Farming gave humans more food in good times, but in bad times, it magnified every weakness. And the pressure of needing a successful harvest pushed humans into a kind of competition they had never experienced. Land wasn't just useful, it was life. Water wasn't just helpful, it was survival. If your neighbor had a river and yours dried up, that wasn't an inconvenience. That was a death sentence. Suddenly, groups didn't just compete at chance encounters. Now competition was baked into the landscape. Owning a good piece of land meant security. Losing that land meant collapse. Conflict wasn't accidental anymore. It was structural. People built boundaries. They protected fields. They guarded rivers. And when scarcity hit, they didn't just fight predators. They fought each other. A single drought could push communities into desperate clashes. A bad season could destroy peace that lasted generations. The world humans had once moved freely across was shrinking into small territories that groups would defend against anything and anyone. And when you compress multiple hungry, anxious farming communities into the same region, you create a pressure cooker that can explode over the smallest spark. Farming also changed how humans saw leadership. Before, leaders earned respect by skill, hunting, healing, guiding. Now leaders controlled food stores, land rights, and access to water. That meant arguments grew sharper, power struggles grew more serious, and pressure inside communities grew heavier. A bad leader could doom a group as easily as a bad harvest. And while all this was happening, the environment kept shifting. Climate didn't care that humans had finally settled down. Rain patterns changed. Temperatures swung. Some regions dried out for generations. Others became colder. The world humans depended on couldn't stay stable, and farming communities paid the price every time it shifted. People today imagine that farming made life easier, but for early humans, it made life more fragile. Entire families could do everything right: store grain, guard fields, manage resources, and still lose everything because a single season broke them. Farming made humans powerful in the long run, but in the beginning, it exposed them to a level of risk they'd never faced. They weren't losing individuals anymore. They were losing whole communities. And yet, humans didn't abandon the experiment. They doubled down. They improved tools. They learned which seeds survived droughts and which ones needed shade. They watched the sky more carefully. They adjusted planting times. They experimented with irrigation long before they had a name for it. They learned to store food underground or dry it so it wouldn't spoil. Piece by piece, humans started fighting back against the danger farming created. But the biggest threat of all was still forming. A threat even farming couldn't prepare them for. A threat that came not from nature itself, but from the way humans and the environment collided in unpredictable ways. As early farming communities grew, humans imagined they finally had control. They knew where their next meal would come from. They had shelters that stayed in one place, and they had groups large enough to defend themselves. But that confidence didn't last, because the world changed again, and this time it changed faster than humans could keep up. Climate didn't shift slowly anymore. It lurched. Rain patterns flipped unexpectedly. Entire regions that once supported life became unreliable. A valley that fed hundreds for generations could suddenly produce almost nothing. Rivers that had been steady for centuries shrank or shifted course. Cold periods arrived out of nowhere. Heat waves burned young crops before they matured. Early farmers had built their lives on the assumption that seasons would behave normally, but nature had no interest in cooperating. Every time the environment shifted, the consequences hit harder than before, because farming communities were locked to the land. They couldn't simply pack up and move like their ancestors. Their homes, their storage, their future, everything depended on a place that might not support them tomorrow. So the world swung unpredictably, and humans found themselves trapped inside the swings. When a drought lasted longer than expected, entire communities starved. When flooding arrived months early, fields washed away. A cold snap meant seeds never sprouted. A hot year meant water dried up before harvest. Nature wasn't just difficult, it was unstable, and instability was deadly for people who lived by long-term planning. And just when humans were struggling with the environment, they had to deal with something else. Large settled groups brought challenges that nomadic life never faced. Diseases thrived in close quarters. One contaminated water source could make entire villages sick. Food stored for months could rot, mold, or attract pests, and eating spoiled grain could be as deadly as famine itself. A single mistake could ruin an entire season of stored food. Meanwhile, pressure between neighboring communities grew heavier. When the environment failed, people didn't necessarily migrate peacefully. They arrived hungry and desperate. Groups collided at rivers, hunting grounds, and fertile valleys, and competition turned into conflict. The same intelligence that allowed humans to cooperate now fueled strategies for raiding, defending, and taking resources before someone else did. A small scarcity didn't stay small. It spread. It rippled outward into fights, migrations, and collapses. If one group lost its harvest, they went looking for food elsewhere. The community they wandered into suddenly faced twice as many mouths, twice as many claims on land, twice as much pressure. And once desperation entered a region, it didn't disappear quickly. Humans had become powerful, but they had also become more vulnerable. Small hunter-gatherer groups could bounce back after a bad season. Farming societies could not. Their success depended on consistency, and when the planet stopped being consistent, survival became a gamble again. And yet, through all of this, humans didn't fall apart. They adapted not by moving, but by thinking ahead. They learned how to read patterns in climate, when to expect dry periods, when to plant early, when to plant late. They discovered the value of storing surplus, not just for winter, but for unexpected disasters. They started developing irrigation systems and ways to catch and redirect water. They learned to preserve food more effectively and to build shelters that protected grain from rain, pests, and heat. The world kept shifting, but humans began shifting with it. The most important development wasn't a tool. It was the idea of long-term planning. Humans began preparing for problems before they happened. They learned to assume the environment would betray them eventually, and that assumption saved more lives than any weapon or invention. They discovered that information mattered, and people began sharing knowledge across groups. Which seeds survived droughts, which riverbanks flooded regularly, which animals migrated where, which diseases came after which seasons. This was the moment when humanity turned a corner. People had spent millions of years reacting to disaster. Now they were predicting it. Language grew richer. Stories became lessons instead of entertainment. And memories of past disasters were passed down as warnings, so future generations wouldn't to repeat the same mistakes. But none of these improvements meant humans were safe yet. They were still dealing with the same fundamental enemy, a world that refused to stay still. And the next step, the step that pushed humans into true civilization, was learning how to build systems that could survive unpredictable change. By the time early humans reached this final stage of prehistory, they had survived everything the planet threw at them. Predators, droughts, floods, sickness, hunger, migrations, clashes with other groups, and climate swings so extreme they could erase entire landscapes in a single generation. But what changed everything wasn't a tool, or fire, or even farming. It was the moment humans learned to build systems strong enough to survive a world that refused to be predictable. Up until now, every generation lived on the edge of collapse. If the weather turned unexpectedly cold, communities starved. If the rain came at the wrong time, crops failed. If disease swept through a village, entire families vanished. And when one settlement collapsed, others around it often followed, because humans were tightly connected to their environment and each other. One crisis created ripples that could take years to recover from. But eventually, humans stopped treating survival as something that happened day by day or season by season. They began thinking years ahead, decades ahead. They started building ways of life that could take a hit and still hold together. The most important shift was the way communities learned to manage risk. Instead of trusting a single crop, they planted multiple. Instead of relying on one water source, they dug channels, built simple dams, and stored water in pits and jars. Instead of waiting for food to run out, they dried it, smoked it, buried it safely, and kept it sealed for emergencies. They turned survival from a gamble into a strategy. At the same time, humans learned something even more powerful. Information was worth more than tools. Groups that shared knowledge survived disasters that destroyed groups who kept everything to themselves. If one settlement figured out how to handle a new disease, that information spread. If another found a way to grow food on dry land, others copied it. If someone discovered that a certain plant signaled upcoming rain or drought, that knowledge could save hundreds of lives. Knowledge became the first real infrastructure of civilization, invisible but priceless. This is also when collaboration expanded beyond single groups. People started forming alliances, creating exchange routes, and building trust between different communities. They traded food, inventions, safe paths, warnings, and protection. A community that faced disaster no longer stood alone. It had support. Humans finally realized they didn't have to survive as isolated groups. They could survive as a network. And as soon as humans began working together on a wider scale, something new took shape. Not cities yet, not kingdoms, just the early foundation of organized life. Leadership based on experience rather than fear. Elders who remembered past disasters advising younger generations. Rituals that preserved important knowledge. Traditions that acted like early laws. Systems that didn't depend on one person or one season or one lucky year. Systems that lasted. This was the moment when humans finally became stronger than the threats around them. Not because the world became safer, it didn't, but because humans learned how to build stability even when the world failed to offer it. They could absorb bad seasons. They could recover from sickness. They could negotiate instead of fight. They could relocate more intelligently. They could rebuild faster. Prehistoric humans didn't beat danger by becoming tougher than everything else. They beat danger by becoming smarter than everything else. And that is why the biggest threat prehistoric humans ever faced wasn't the predators or rival tribes or even starvation. It was the speed of change, the way the world could transform faster than humans could adapt. But instead of disappearing, humans became the species that adapted faster than the world could break them. Every person alive today comes from the ones who figured out how to do that, the people who learned to anticipate disaster, communicate across distances, preserve lessons for the future, and create systems that kept communities alive even when everything around them collapsed. The rise of civilization didn't start with monuments or cities. It started with people deciding to outthink the world instead of just reacting to it. And that decision, made thousands of years before writing or metal or cities, is the reason humanity survived the greatest threat it ever faced.